Okay, so the floor is open to questions.
Thank you very much for very clear and inspiring papers, though I'm not an historian, an intellectual historian, and yet I understood what each one of you was saying, so I think that's, I'm very happy with that. My question is for the two first speakers, for John and Arjan, in the sense that we get this al-Hamawiyya al-Kubra and the text against the Shadhili. You focus especially on the impact that it may have had on others. My question is, does it also go the other way around? These texts are written like in late 1290s, early 1300s. What happens after, from Ibn Taymiyya's perspective? Does his thinking change as a response to or in a dialogue with the reactions he gets from others?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Can you hear me adequately with this? Okay. It's actually part of my bigger project is to trace where Ibn Taymiyya goes after Hamawiyya al-Kubra. Of course, he ends up in prison. He gets out. One of my research questions is, why do the Mamluks let him out? And then I am hypothesizing that he moderates his discourse a little bit without changing its substance as he writes some of his major works back in Damascus after he returns in 1312, 1313. Is that right? So it's still to be found out. And I think it's really interesting with Iṣfahānī and how Ibn Taymiyya seems to get along with Iṣfahānī fine, if that's what I gather from your paper. Has Ibn Taymiyya sort of taken stock of reality and said, well, I need to be a good colleague and a good player in the scene even though I don't agree? That's what seems to be the upshot of these observations.
Yes. Does this thing? I don't think this thing does anything. Anyway, I'll just speak a little bit louder. When it comes to the Rad ala Shadhili, it's impossible to say anything when it comes to Shadhili himself. Other than perhaps what I've mentioned regarding Ibn Taymiyya's admirer Ahmad al-Wasti, who clearly takes over Ibn Taymiyya's opinion regarding Shadhili, because to give an example, one of the earlier works of al-Wasti must have been his Rihla, which is a sort of an autobiographical work, where he still praises the Shadhiliyya, and then in another work he says that the Shadhili himself has some mistakes that resemble philosophy, and he specifically mentions that Shadhili uses the word al-aql al-kulli, which actually he doesn't, but he does use the term al-aql, but with in a different context. And this is the argument Ibn Taymiyya makes as well in Rad ala Shadhili. So here, at least he influenced al-Wasti, but apart from that, like I hinted at in the conclusion, it may very well be that Ibn Taymiyya took it a step too far. This remains speculative, of course, but this brings to mind the refutation Ibn al-Jawzi wrote against Abdelkader Jilani, the famous Sufi and eponymous founder of the Qadiriyya, which is completely lost. And I've always had this idea that these kind of refutations are lost for a reason. They're simply not copied because these individuals that are refuted, their position as saints or scholars have been fortified to such an extent that no one has any interest in reading a refutation. So, yeah, if that answers the question.
If I may, this is for both Arjan and John. Arjan, I wonder if, so the Rad is missing the first fasl at least, right?
Yes.
The manuscript is missing the first part. And I'm wondering, since you have seen most of or all of the writings of al-Wasiti, if anything in al-Wasiti gives a hint or sheds light on what might have been in that first fasl, because it drove me crazy when I was reading the Rad. Like, what was the beginning? Because I assumed that it was where he addressed it to al-Iskandari and said, I'm writing you this letter to tell you that you're, off topic or whatever. So that's my question for you, is if you've any insight on that. And then for John, I wondered, your presentation of Ibn Taymiyya's method reminded me somewhat of Maimonides, and I don't know if this might be an unfair question, how familiar you are with Maimonides and the Dalalat al-Ha'irin, but this kind of negative theology of saying, yes, the text says this, and the text means this, and we don't say anything else about it except for that it is not anything like what is on the earth. Is it fair to kind of compare them that way? In this, would you categorize Ibn Taymiyya's theology as a negative theology? I don't know if that's even fair. I'm sorry. I'm done.
Yes. The simple answer is no. There's no way I could reconstruct anything that would have been in this first fossil like an introduction. Though what I can tell you is that if my theory is correct and Ibn Taymiyyah wrote this refutation in Damascus, then I doubt he would have been in contact with Ibn Ata'illah, because his first source for the Shadhiliyah would have been al-Wasti, and al-Wasti never says that he met Ibn Ata'illah. He never mentions him, because Ibn Ata'illah was based in Cairo, and al-Wasti went to Alexandria, and even though he went to Cairo afterwards, he never makes any mention of meeting Shadhilis there. And in Alexandria, he becomes a companion of Najmuddin al-Iṣfahānī, who was apparently a sheikh also within the Shadhiliyah, and a contemporary of Yaqut al-Habashi, and like both Yaqut and Ibn Ata'illah, a pupil of Abul Abbas al-Mursi. So I suspect that perhaps the original motivation for Ibn Taymiyyah could have been the doctrine that was handed over to him through al-Wasiti rather than through Ibn Ata'illah, because it's all focused on Ashadri and nothing on al-Mursi or Ibn Ata'illah or any of Ibn Ata'illah's writings. So I suspect it's something like that. And yeah, other than that, al-Wasiti is only very briefly criticizes Ashadri, and it's apparent from the places where he praises the Shadhiliyah that he must have felt very uncomfortable with the fact that he recognized the Shadhilis as Arifin, and then later he felt uncomfortable when it comes to Ashadili. And this is also remarked by al-Dhahabi in his Tarikh, where he says in the entry on Ashadili or on Ashadili, he says, this man has some problems in his ibarat. And when our sheikh, I think he says Ibn al-Huzami, and he means al-Wasti, when our sheikh noticed this, he felt very uncomfortable or something of that sort towards Ashadili, but he always respected Abul Abbas al-Mursi. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I need to respond to the first question.
You need to
Oh yeah,
respond?
sorry.
To the Maimonides question.
So-
Thank you for the question about Maimonides. My knowledge of Maimonides is very, very minimal. And I really don't know okay, is that better? I don't know the answer to your question because I don't know Maimonides well enough. My minimal study of Maimonides a long time ago, I thought he's more like the Ash'aris, but that aside, I think what's really important to see here, though, is that Ibn Taymiyyah's theology, it's both a positive theology and a negative theology at the same time. And you could say his negative theology is a get-out-of-jail-free card when he's stuck. And I've noticed this, when he's going along and articulating the meanings of God's attributes and what have you, and he encounters a kind of logical problem, well, it's a kind of, okay, he can say simply bila kaif, but that's not really what he's doing. He's saying, I'm simply trying to talk about God in the best possible way. And it doesn't always quite work out, but we need to do that. We need to praise God in all we're doing in our speech about God. And then we say, ultimately, we don't really know. So it's negative theology after a positive articulation.
That's how I read Maimonides too. He has it both ways, or he tries to have it both ways when it suits his purposes.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Question here, question there, and yeah.
So I was struck by Ibn Jama'ah's ta'wil for everybody move. And first, I mean, this seems unusual to me and unprecedented, at least at that point. And I was, is that an incorrect assumption? I simply don't know. And then it seems to me that this response to Ibn Taymiyya, I mean, as you go further, Khalid al-Wahhab has suggested that scholars seem to demand much broader knowledge of theology in these later, a couple hundred years down the road. Is the ironic sort of result of Ibn Taymiyya's influence the becoming amma of theology and ta'wil, or to what extent is the amma? I mean, who are the amma in that?
Yeah, thank you. Those are good questions. I don't know how extensive the amma are subjected to ta'wil after Ibn Jama'ah. I don't know how successful his project was. I don't know any of the answers to those questions. What I do want to say, however, is that in the early Mamluk Sultanate, my impression is Asharism was quite intellectually weak before Iṣfahānī showed up, obviously, and really took the Cairo by storm in these regards. And Ibn Taymiyya, the quality of his argumentation was simply superior to anybody else's at the time. So these guys are trying to find any way they can to resist. And I think then with Iṣfahānī showing up and just the wider tradition of Asharism, Ibn Taymiyya's ways of doing things fade from the memory and perhaps from the Amma. Of course, there's always anthropomorphic tendencies among the Amma, but that's an area which would require a lot more research if we can even find sources to talk about it. What Khalid al-Wahhab, I think, he's been criticized for his article in the Ibn Taymiyya in his Times volume of 2010 for not acknowledging or saying Ibn Taymiyya had no influence. Okay, fair enough. Ibn Taymiyya has had some influence, but Al-Wahhab identifies really well in that article the post-classical Ashari rule of interpretation and its influence, its currency throughout the medieval period, the whole way up into the 19th century. And I think we have to take that very seriously as the dominant orthodoxy of not just the Mamluk regions, but also Tabriz, and that's what that was orthodoxy up through the early 20th century.
Thank you for a great panel. I have a question for Caterina and for Arjan. So the first question is, if I understood you correctly, Ibn Nasr al-Din is defining Shaykh al-Islam in order to be able to apply it to Ibn Taymiyya. So is he drawing on a previous tradition of sort of defining what Shaykh al-Islam comprises? And how does that, who else receives that title that he upholds? And how does that interact with other titles like Mujaddid or other sort of titles like that? And then for Arjan, so there's this idea that Ibn Taymiyya was a Qadri. To what extent do you find evidence for this in his other works on Sufism? And is he championing Qadrism at any point as sort of alternative approach to Sufism? Or is that something that's being read into the text?
Yes. To me, well, the title. I don't know who. I haven't bumped into previous definitions of what a Shaykh al-Islam is. I have bumped into a slightly later definition, which is that given by as-Sakhawi. Which is, and as-Sakhawi clearly draws on Ibn Nasr al-Din al-Dimashqi, but he does not narrow. I mean, Ibn Nasr al-Din al-Dimashqi gives different meanings for this title, but for him the most important one, the one he needs, concerns the hadith transmissions, hadith science, and as-Sakhawi in his biography of Ibn Hajar talks about this, but he does not. I mean, his definition of the title is not so restricted to the hadith science. How does this interact with other titles? This does not emerge at all from Ibn Nasr al-Din al-Dimashqi's. There is a list I have in the PowerPoint. John, could you open it? What? Caterina? I have a list. If we move on towards the end. شيوخ الإسلام. So these are the Shuyukh al-Islam that Ibn Siratin mentions in Ibn Taymiyya's Tabaqa, and a little bit later. It's 3 Shafis and 3 Hanbalis, and they're rather unknown to me, but perhaps you may know them. What is peculiar is that when he presents this bunch of people, he specifies that these people were experts in the science of al-Jarh wa ta'dil. So he really focuses on this. This is really his preoccupation. Perhaps because he was a hadith scholar. I mean, and then before that, he mentions the Shuyukh al-Islam of previous generations from after the Sahaba: Hasan al-Basri, Mujahid, Taus, Malik ibn Anas, ibn Jurayh, al-Awza'i, Sufyan al-Thawri, Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. And then there is a big gap, and he says, every generation has his own Shuyukh al-Islam. And then he mentions an-Nawawi, and this Muhammad Abdurrahman ibn al-Hasan al-Asnawi. And after defining who is a Shaykh al-Islam, he also says, I'm going to offer you a bunch of names. I'm not going to be exhaustive. Yeah? Pardon? It's not there. But it's later. It's a little bit later.
Yeah, it's good. Yes, regarding the supposed Qadri affiliation of Ibn Taymiyya, it's rather problematic, because if you look, this is of course based on a famous article of George Makdisi, where he found a manuscript that has this silsila, and there are several problems there. One of them is that he says that Ibn Taymiyya is claimed to have said that the best khirqa is the Qadri khirqa, and when you look at his fatwa, you find that he has a very intellectual, academic exposition of the tradition of khirqa, and he in no way seems to imply, he says that he is part of the tradition in some sense, but clearly he elaborates on it and sort of says, yeah, it has no basis in Islam, and he never says that he is a Qadri himself, nowhere. He always respects Abdelkader Jilani, so that is the first problem. That I have to add to that he also says that to say that the best affiliation in Tasawwuf is to say I'm Qadri, and the best in fiqh is to say I'm Hanbali, that he disapproves of this. So the fact that this is written in this silsila that Makdisi found is already a bit strange then. And then if you look at the silsila, you find that it is claimed that Muwafaq al-Dīn and Abu Umar al-Maqdisi, 2 brothers, that they received the khirqa from Abdelkader Jilani, and that they passed it on to Ibn Abi Umar, who was just here in the slide as well. And Ibn Abi Umar was indeed a sheikh of Ibn Taymiyya. This is a fact from the Tabaqat al-Hanabila. But the problem here is that Abu Umar never traveled to Baghdad. Muwafaq al-Dīn traveled to Baghdad together with his cousin Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi. So Abu Umar would never have met Abdul Qadir Jilani. And when Muwafaq al-Dīn went to Baghdad, he was only, I think, for 30 days or less even before Abdul Qadir Jilani passed away. So, but he took hadith and he took fiqh from Abdul Qadir Jilani, but in terms of tasawwuf, there's nothing to be found except for a few hadith that he took from Abdul Qadir that have something of a spiritual meaning. So take all this evidence taken together, and together with the fact that Al-Wasiti never says that he considers himself a Qadri, which you would expect if he became a follower of Ibn Taymiyya, that gives me the impression that we shouldn't consider Ibn Taymiyya a Qadri anymore. He was influenced in a sense by Abdul Qadir in that he was aware of his Futuh al-Ghaib, but he sort of reinterprets it in his own way, and we can't really say that he was a Sufi. And in my dissertation, I actually make the argument that Ibn Taymiyyah was not the Sufi sheikh for his Jama'ah, but that it was his follower Ahmad Imad ad-Din al-Wasti. So that's in short the whole history of Sufism for Ibn Taymiyyah.